There was a cabinet in the back of the Quonset hut that nobody had been able to open in 31 years. It stood against the curved metal wall like it had grown there, a squat steel box, welded shut along one seam. Its door held closed by a padlock so rusted it had fused into a single solid lump of orange decay. Somebody, once, had painted a strip of yellow caution tape across it, and the paint had long since flaked into little curling scabs on the concrete floor. Whatever was inside had been waiting so long that the waiting itself seemed to have a smell. Cold metal, old oil, and underneath that, something sweeter. Paper, maybe. Or rot. Josie Calloway didn't know any of that yet. She was still 400 miles away, sitting in a gas station parking lot in a car that wouldn't start on the first try anymore, counting $327 for the second time to make sure she hadn't miscounted the first. She was 22 years old. She had a duffel bag, a car with a bad starter, and a voicemail from a lawyer's office she hadn't returned yet because she already knew what it would say. Her grandfather was dead. Her sisters were getting the house, and there was, apparently, a small additional matter involving a piece of property Josie had never once heard him mention in her life. What she didn't yet understand, what none of them understood, not even her sisters, who thought they'd walked away with everything worth having, was that the least valuable thing in Everett Calloway's estate was about to turn out to be the only thing that mattered. If you've ever been handed the thing nobody else wanted and told to be grateful for it, you already know exactly how that first phone call felt. 3 weeks earlier, Josie hadn't even known her grandfather was sick. That was its own kind of small, quiet cruelty, the kind her family specialized in. Everett Calloway had raised 3 granddaughters after their parents scattered in different directions of failure and distance. And somewhere in that raising, Josie had ended up the one who left first, argued loudest, and came back least. Her sisters, Ruth and Faye, had stayed close. They'd gone to the funeral in matching black dresses and sat in the front pew like they'd rehearsed it. Josie had come in 60 seconds before the service started, in the only clean shirt she owned, and sat in the back. Before you settle in, hey, welcome, if this is your first time here. I tell stories like this one every week, about people who start with almost nothing and end up building something nobody saw coming. If that sounds like your kind of story, stick around. The reading of the will happened 4 days later in a lawyer's office that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. Ruth got the house. Faye got the land behind it, 11 acres that backed up to a creek, worth real money if you knew who to sell it to, and Josie got a single line, read aloud by a lawyer who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. To my granddaughter Josephine, I leave the Quonset hut property on Route 9, along with the sum of $1, and my apology for waiting too long to explain myself. Nobody laughed, exactly, but Ruth made a sound that was close to it. The apology was the part that stuck, not the dollar. A dollar was a joke. Everybody understood that, a punchline dressed up as an inheritance. But Grandfather Calloway had never apologized for anything in his life. Not once. Not that Josie had ever witnessed. And there it was, in black type on legal paper, 3 days after they'd put him in the ground. My apology for waiting too long to explain myself. Explain what? Nobody in that office had an answer, and nobody offered to look for one. The property itself came with a catch that made the whole inheritance feel like one more small cruelty tacked onto a life already full of them. $340 in unpaid county fees, going back almost a decade, that had to be settled before the deed would transfer into her name. Josie had exactly $327 to her name, and nowhere to sleep that wasn't her car. She paid it anyway. Every last cent she had, plus the 20 her sister Faye handed her afterward, without quite looking at her. Not out of guilt, Josie suspected, but because Faye had never learned how to sit with an uneven feeling and not try to fix it with cash. She drove out to see it the next morning, because there was nowhere else left to drive to. Route 9 ran along the edge of a town called Millrace Fork, population small enough that the welcome sign didn't bother updating the number anymore. The land backed onto scrubby pine and a drainage ditch that ran orange with iron. And there, set back from the road on a half-acre nobody had mowed in years, was the Quonset hut, a long, corrugated steel half-cylinder, the kind of building you'd expect to hold farm equipment or nothing at all. Its metal skin gone the mottled brown-orange of a decade's rust, one-end doorframe hanging crooked on a single hinge. Josie sat in her car for a long time before she got out, long enough that the engine ticked as it cooled. The wind was doing something strange through the gap in the door hinge, a low, hollow whistle, almost like the building was breathing. She could smell wet rust and pine sap through the cracked window, and somewhere behind the hut, a crow was working through its whole vocabulary, unbothered by her arrival. This is it, she thought. This is what he left me. For one long moment, sitting there with the engine ticking and the crow going on and on, she almost put the car back in reverse. She had $3 left after the fee, and the tank was under a quarter. Going back to whatever she'd left behind would at least be a known kind of hard. This, an orphaned half-acre and a building shaped like a soup can, was an unknown kind entirely. But there wasn't a back to go to. Not really. Hadn't been for a while. So she got out of the car, and the gravel crunched under boots that weren't warm enough for the wind coming off the pines, and she walked toward the crooked door with her hands jammed in her pockets and her breath fogging in front of her, and she pulled it open on a groan of metal that hadn't moved in years. The inside was darker than she expected, and colder somehow than the wind outside. Dust hung suspended in the one shaft of grey daylight cutting through a gap in the roof panels. Old shelving, collapsed in one corner, a stack of paint cans fused together with rust. And against the back wall, half swallowed in shadow, something square and steel-cornered that didn't belong with the rest of the junk, something that had, at some point, been deliberately closed and deliberately kept that way. Josie crossed the concrete floor toward it, her footsteps echoing off curved metal, and she had no idea yet that she was looking at the first thread of an answer to a question her grandfather had waited 31 years, and one apology too long to ask. The cabinet didn't open. Not that morning, and not for lack of trying. Josie crouched in front of it for a long time, running her fingers along the seam where door met frame, feeling for a latch, a keyhole, anything besides the fused lump of rust where a padlock had once been. The metal was cold enough to sting. When she pressed her palm flat against the door and pushed, it didn't so much as shift. Whatever was holding it shut wasn't just the lock. Something inside had settled against it, or the frame itself had warped over 3 decades of damp. She rapped her knuckles against the steel and got back a flat, dead sound, no echo, like the inside was packed tight. Later, she told herself, standing and brushing rust flakes off her palms. You need a crowbar and daylight, not curiosity. She had neither at the moment, and a colder problem besides. She had nowhere to sleep that wasn't the car, and the car had maybe 40 miles left in it, before the gaslight started doing more than blinking. She spent the rest of that first hour doing an inventory of what she actually owned, in the plainest sense of owning something. A steel building, with one working door, and a roof that leaked in at least one place. A half-acre of weeds gone knee-high, still silvered with the last of the morning frost. A cabinet she couldn't open. $3 and change. A grandfather's apology she didn't understand. It wasn't nothing. She kept telling herself that, walking the perimeter of the hut, with her arms crossed against the wind. It wasn't nothing, because nothing didn't come with a deed, and a deed meant a mailing address, and a mailing address meant she could stop putting her sister Faye's old apartment down on job applications like it still meant something. She found the well pump around back, seized up with disuse but intact. Found a rain barrel, cracked but salvageable. Found, propped against the far outside wall under a warped sheet of plywood, a name carved crookedly into a support post inside the doorframe. Not her grandfather's name. A different one. T. Voss, 1962. She stood looking at it for a while, the wind picking at her collar, filing it away without knowing yet that it was the kind of detail a story like this one doesn't waste. By early afternoon, hunger made the decision for her that pride had been arguing against, and she walked the 1.5 miles into Millrace Fork, looking for the cheapest food in town, and, if she was honest with herself, for anybody who might know something about a man who'd owned a Quonset hut on Route 9 for 30 years, and never once mentioned it. The diner on Main Street had a bell over the door and 4 people in it, counting the woman behind the counter. Josie ordered coffee because it was the only thing she could afford twice, and she was 2 sips into it when the man 2 stools down, heavy-set, in a canvas coat gone soft with wear, somewhere north of 60, looked over at her like he'd been turning something over in his mind and had finally placed it. "You're Calloway's granddaughter," he said, not a question. Josie set the coffee down carefully. Word travels. Word's about the only thing that does around here. He said it without much humor, but not unkindly either. He introduced himself as Dale Pruitt, said he ran the hardware store 2 doors down, said he'd sold Everett Calloway roofing nails for that Quonset hut, back when Josie was probably still in diapers. Man kept to himself about that place, Dale said. Bought it, worked on it some, then just stopped going out there. Must have been, what, 15 years ago now. Do you know why? Dale turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, the kind of small stalling gesture people make when they're deciding how much of the truth is theirs to give away. Not my business to guess at a dead man's reasons, he said. But I'll tell you this much. He wasn't the first owner. Hut was already standing when he bought the land. Older fella built it, back in the 60s. Kept goats in it, I heard, before it went to livestock in general. Calloway bought the land off the estate after the fella passed, and near as anybody could tell, he never tore down a thing that was already there. Odd for a man who liked things done his own way. T. Voss, 1962. The name from the support post surfaced in her mind, unbidden, and settled there next to Dale's story like 2 pieces that were clearly meant to fit, if only she had the third to show her how. You know his name? Josie asked. The first owner? Dale thought about it, or pretended to, and shook his head. Before my time, some of it. You'd want to ask Marguerite, over at the church. She keeps the county records nobody else bothers with. Woman remembers everything. Probably remembers what your grandfather had for breakfast the day he closed on that land. Josie didn't have bus fare for a trip to the church that afternoon, let alone the nerve to walk in on a stranger and start asking about a dead man's secrets. She thanked Dale for the coffee refill he waved off charging her for, and walked back out into a wind that had picked up teeth since morning, turning the possibility of Marguerite and the records over in her mind, the whole 1.5 miles back to the hut. She got back as the light was starting to go long and orange across the weeds, and found, propped against her car, a folded lawn chair and a paper sack that hadn't been there when she left. Inside the sack, 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of something that turned out to be vegetable soup, still faintly warm, and a note in handwriting so careful it looked almost typed. Heard you were out here. Nights get cold fast this time of year. No charge, no visit needed. Just don't want you going hungry on Calloway's land. R. Whitfield, 3 houses down the road. Josie stood in the dimming light holding the sack and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have a ready name for. She hadn't asked anyone for anything. She hadn't even known anyone was watching. And yet here was a stranger's soup, still warm, on a 1/2 acre of weeds she'd owned for less than a day. She ate the sandwiches sitting in the lawn chair just inside the crooked doorway, watching the light fail outside in long orange bands through the gap in the roof panels, and when it got too dark to see the cabinet clearly, she found herself glancing at it anyway, every few minutes, like it might do something if she wasn't looking. It didn't. Whatever was inside had been patient for 31 years. It could wait one more night for her to find a crowbar. But before she banked down for a cold and uncertain sleep in the back seat of her car, she went back to the support post one more time, ran her thumb over the carved letters, T. Voss, 1962, and found, just below it, half hidden by 3 decades of grime she hadn't noticed in the daylight, a second line she'd missed the first time. 4 words, cut into the wood with the same rough hand. Ask her about the well. The well pump sat exactly where she remembered it, crusted with rust and disuse, angled a little into the ground like it had given up standing straight years ago. Josie stood over it in the grey early light, with her breath fogging, turning 4 carved words over in her mind. Ask her about the well. Her could mean anybody, but there was only one her Josie had heard mentioned since arriving, Marguerite, over at the church, the woman who kept the records nobody else bothered with. She didn't have bus fare, so she walked. Millrace Fork in the early morning was a smaller town than it had looked the day before. One main street, a hardware store, the diner, a church with white clapboard siding gone the soft grey of weathered wood. She found Marguerite in the church office, sorting a box of yellowed ledgers, a small woman, somewhere past 70, with reading glasses pushed up into steel grey hair. And when Josie explained who she was and why she'd come, Marguerite's hands went still over the papers, in a way that told Josie she'd struck something before she'd even finished asking. Calloway's granddaughter, Marguerite said, echoing Dale from the day before, though her tone carried something heavier than his had. I wondered if one of you would ever come asking. Somebody carved a message into the doorframe, Josie said. T. Voss, 1962. And underneath it, ask her about the well. I don't know who her is supposed to be. I was hoping it might be you. Marguerite was quiet long enough that Josie thought she might simply decline to answer, the way Dale had declined to guess at a dead man's reasons. But then the older woman pulled out a chair and gestured for Josie to sit, and began, slowly, the way people do when they're deciding how much of an old story is safe to hand to someone who's only just arrived in the middle of it. Thomas Voss built that hut with his brother, back when it still had goats in it, and nobody thought twice about the land, Marguerite said. Good men, both of them, but poor, dust poor, the kind of poor that doesn't leave much behind. Thomas passed in the winter of '68. Never married, no children. The land sat empty a long while after, until your grandfather bought it off the county. Oh, must have been 78, 79. Nobody's told me why he'd want it, Josie said. It's not good land. It's not close to anything. No, Marguerite agreed. It isn't. She said nothing further on that point, which felt, to Josie, like its own kind of answer. The kind that meant there was a reason, and Marguerite either didn't know it or wasn't the one who got to tell it. As for the well, she went on instead, that I can tell you plainly enough, because it isn't a secret, just a story nobody's thought to repeat in years. Thomas Voss dug that well by hand, during a drought, bad enough that half the county's stock wells ran dry. His well never did, struck a vein deeper than anybody expected. People used to drive out from 3 towns over just to fill barrels from it, back before the county ran proper water lines through. There's people alive today, my age and older, who'd tell you that well-kept families going through a summer that broke a lot of others. Something in Josie's chest tightened at that, an unexpected weight for a story about a hole in the ground. She thought about the wind whistling through the crooked doorframe, the way the hut had felt less like an abandoned building and more like something that had once mattered enormously to people whose names nobody remembered to say out loud anymore. "So the message," Josie said slowly. "Ask her about the well. That's not asking about water. That's asking about what the well meant." Marguerite looked at her for a long moment, something like approval settling into the lines around her eyes. "You might be quicker than your grandfather was," she said. "Took him the better part of a year to work that much out, far as I ever heard." That single sentence landed harder than Marguerite likely intended. Took him the better part of a year. Which meant Everett Calloway had stood exactly where Josie now stood, puzzling over the same carved words, sometime in the years before Josie was even born. And whatever he'd eventually worked out had been enough to keep him coming back to that land for over a decade, and then, just as strangely, enough to make him stop. She wanted to ask more, wanted to press for whatever came next in that unfinished sentence, but Marguerite had already turned back to her ledgers with the particular finality of someone who'd given what she meant to give for one sitting, and Josie understood, without being told outright, that some of this story was going to have to be earned in pieces, the way Marguerite herself had clearly earned it. She walked back to the property with the wind at her back this time, and found R. Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a grey-streaked beard and the sun-weathered look of someone who'd spent a life outdoors, leaning against her car with a toolbox at his feet, like he'd been waiting a while and hadn't minded it. "Figured you'd need this before you needed most anything else," he said, nodding at the toolbox. "Pry bar, socket set, couple other odds and ends. You can give it back whenever, or never. Makes no difference to me." He introduced himself properly this time, Russell Whitfield, said he'd farmed the land 3 parcels down for going on 30 years, said his late wife used to be the one who checked in on old Calloway back when he still drove out here regular. "She know him well?" Josie asked, careful, remembering Marguerite's caution. "Well enough," Russell said, something flickering behind his eyes that he didn't offer to explain. "Well enough to worry about him, toward the end of his coming out here. Man used to sit in that hut for hours some days, not working on a thing, just sitting. My wife used to say, a person doesn't sit still that long in a cold building unless they're wrestling with something too big to carry standing up." He didn't elaborate further, and Josie didn't push. Russell had the particular quiet of a man who gave help freely, but information carefully, and she suspected pushing too hard too fast would close a door that had only just cracked open. Instead, she thanked him for the toolbox, and he waved it off the same way Dale had waved off the coffee, and told her, before he left, that the well pump could likely be primed back to working with an hour's effort and a bucket of water to prime it, if she wanted running water on the property sooner rather than later. She did. She spent the rest of that afternoon working the rusted pump handle under Russell's brief instruction, her palms blistering inside a pair of his spare work gloves, until on the 40th or 50th stroke, the pump gave a deep, protesting groan and spat out a stream of rust-brown water that ran, slowly, clear. She stood there with clear water running over her wrists in the cold afternoon light, thinking about a drought 50 years gone, and a well that had never run dry, and a message carved into wood that had taken her grandfather the better part of a year to understand. "Ask her about the well," Thomas Voss had written, sometime in 1962, to someone whose name nobody living seemed to remember. Josie shut off the pump and looked back toward the cabinet waiting in the shadow of the hut, and thought, for the first time since arriving, that maybe it wasn't the only thing on this property with something worth prying open. She waited until morning to try the cabinet, mostly because Russell's toolbox didn't have a flashlight worth trusting in the dark, and partly because some part of her wanted daylight for whatever came next. Good news or bad, she wanted to see it clearly. The pry bar went into the seam where door met frame easier than she expected. The rusted hinge giving a low groan of protest, the second real pressure landed on it. She worked it slow, the way Russell had shown her the day before with the well pump. Steady pressure, not force. Let the rust do the breaking, not your back. And on the third try, the door gave all at once, swinging open on a shriek of metal that startled a pair of crows off the roof outside. The smell hit her first. Old paper, cedar, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, machine oil, gone stale with decades of sitting still. Not rot, the way she'd half expected. Something that had been sealed away carefully, on purpose, by someone who'd meant for it to last. Inside, wrapped in a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat a metal strongbox, smaller than the cabinet itself, its corners rounded with wear, a simple clasp lock holding it shut that looked almost gentle compared to the rusted mess she'd just fought through. Beside it, a stack of ledgers bound with twine, their covers soft and water-stained at the edges. And tucked into a side pocket sewn crudely into the tarp, a single brass key, small enough to fit in her palm, still bright where it had been protected from air and damp. Josie sat back on her heels in the cold morning light and just looked at it all for a long moment, hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, or not only from the cold. The key fit the strongbox on the first try. Inside, bundled cash, banded in stacks that had clearly been counted and recounted by careful hands, more money than Josie had seen in one place in her entire life. She didn't count it right then, couldn't quite make her hands do the math, sitting there with her breath fogging and her heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her ears. Underneath the bundled cash, a manila envelope, unsealed, containing what looked like old property deeds. Not just the Quonset hut parcel, but two others, names and townships she didn't recognize, dated decades back. And beneath that, at the very bottom of the box, a letter. The envelope yellowed but intact, sealed with a line of tape, gone brittle and translucent with age. Her name was on the front. Not Josephine, formal and distant like the will had used. Just Josie, the way almost no one in her family had bothered to call her since she was small. She didn't open it right away. She sat there a long time, the strongbox open in her lap, the cold working its way up through the concrete floor into her knees, and let herself feel, for the first time since the funeral, something other than the flat grey exhaustion she'd been running on for weeks. Not relief exactly, something closer to being seen, the strange, disorienting sensation of discovering that a man who'd barely spoken to her in the last 5 years of his life had, at some point, sat in this exact spot and thought carefully, deliberately, about her. Eventually, she opened the ledgers instead of the letter, because the ledgers felt safer somehow, less likely to undo her completely before she'd had breakfast. They weren't financial records, not in the way she expected. They were something closer to a journal, dated entries spanning back nearly 15 years, her grandfather's handwriting, cramped, slanted, unmistakably his, recording not numbers but observations. Weather, small repairs made to the hut. Notes about people in town, Dale at the hardware store, a woman named Ruth Voss he mentioned more than once, with a tenderness that surprised her, given the name's overlap with her own sister's. Ruth Voss, she read, asked after the well again today, told her it still runs true. She smiled the way her father used to. Her father, Thomas Voss, which meant Ruth Voss. A different Ruth than her sister, she realized with a small jolt, had been Thomas's daughter, someone Marguerite hadn't mentioned, someone who was apparently still alive, still asking after the well, sometime in the years these ledgers covered. Ask her about the well, the carving had said, not Marguerite, Ruth Voss. Josie set the ledger down with hands that weren't entirely steady. the pieces of something larger beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, without yet forming a picture she could see whole. Her grandfather hadn't just owned this land. He'd known the Voss family, known Ruth Voss specifically, cared enough to note her smile in a private journal he'd never once mentioned to his own granddaughters. And somewhere in that connection was buried whatever reason had made him stop coming out here at all, sometime in the last years of his life. She thought about Russell's words from the day before. A person doesn't sit still that long in a cold building unless they're wrestling with something too big to carry standing up. Outside, she heard a truck pull up along the gravel and found Russell again, this time with a thermos of coffee instead of a toolbox, and behind him, walking a little slower, leaning on a cane she hadn't seen before, an old woman Josie didn't recognize. "Heard you finally got that cabinet open," Russell said, setting the thermos down on the hood of Josie's car. "Word travels fast around here, in case you hadn't noticed yet." The old woman studied Josie for a long moment, with pale, sharp eyes that didn't miss much, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed a sentence in her head for a long time, before finally getting the chance to say it out loud. "My father dug that well by hand," she said. "I'm Ruth Voss, and I expect you and I have a great deal to talk about." Josie stood there in the cold morning light, with a strong box of money at her feet, and a letter with her name on it, still unopened in her jacket pocket, looking at a woman whose father had carved a message into a doorframe over 60 years ago. A message meant, all along, not for Marguerite, not for Josie, but for whatever granddaughter or grandson eventually stood exactly where Josie was standing now. "I think we do," Josie said. "Would you like to come in? I've got coffee, apparently, and I think there's a lot I need you to help me understand." Ruth Voss's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was headed there. "About the money," she said, "or about the letter you're carrying in your pocket like it might bite you." The Josie looked down at her own jacket, startled, and found she had no good answer for how the old woman had known it was there at all. They sat inside the hut, on two mismatched folding chairs Russell produced from his truck, coffee steaming in the cold air. Ruth Voss settled across from Josie, with her cane propped against her knee, and her sharp, pale eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, like she was looking not at the strongbox, but through the years it had been sitting closed. "Your grandfather and I met the year after my father died," Ruth said. 1969. I was younger than you are now, if you can believe that. And this land had gone to the county for back taxes. Nobody in my family had money to pay. Everett Calloway bought it near 10 years later, once he'd saved enough, for almost nothing. But he didn't buy it to farm it, or sell it, or do much of anything with it at all. Not at first. He bought it because he'd heard the story of the well, how it never ran dry during the worst drought this county ever saw. And he thought a piece of land with a story like that deserved better than to be forgotten. Josie turned the sealed envelope over once in her hands. Why didn't he ever mention any of this? Not once, not to any of us. Ruth was quiet a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation so much as care in choosing what came next. "Because your grandfather carried guilt the way some men carry a limp," she said, quietly, and for a very long time, and mostly where nobody else could see it. "My father died owing more than his family could pay, in a year when a lot of families around here were losing everything at once. Everett was young then, and he had a little money saved, and he could have helped, could have paid what my father owed and kept our family on this land. He didn't. Told me once, years later, that he was saving that money for a house of his own, for a family he wanted to start, and he told himself the Voss debt wasn't his to fix. By the time he'd built that house, married, had children of his own, my father had already passed, and we'd already lost the place. So he bought it back," Josie said slowly. "Years later. As a way of trying to undo something that couldn't be undone, Ruth said. That's exactly what it was, and exactly why it never quite worked. And I expect that's why he stopped coming out here toward the end. A person can only sit with a regret so long before the sitting itself starts to feel like another kind of failure. Josie looked down at the envelope in her hands, her name written across the front in her grandfather's cramped, careful script, and understood, with a weight that settled somewhere just beneath her ribs, that she was about to read the apology the will had only summarized in a single legal line. She broke the brittle tape and slid the letter free. Josie, if you're reading this, I expect it means I never found the nerve to explain it myself, which will not surprise you, and it does not much surprise me either. I was never a man who found it easy to say the hard things out loud, and I am sorrier for that than I know how to put in a letter that has to do the job my own voice should have done a long time ago. I bought this land because of a mistake I made when I was young and had money and told myself I couldn't spare it. A family lost this place because I decided my own future mattered more than their present, and I have spent the better part of my life since trying to make peace with that decision, without much success. I could never bring myself to sell this property, or build on it the way I'd once planned, or even to speak of it much, because every time I stood on this ground, I remembered exactly what it had cost somebody else. I am leaving it to you, along with what I managed to set aside over the years, not because I think money fixes what I did, and not because I think you owe this family anything either. I am leaving it to you because you are the one among my grandchildren who has always understood what it means to start over with almost nothing, and I hope, you are the one who might know what to do with a piece of land that is asking, quietly, to be given a second chance instead of simply forgotten. The money is not the gift, Josie. I want you to understand that clearly, because I fear it will be easy to mistake one for the other. The gift is the land itself, and the well that never ran dry even when everything around it did, and whatever you choose to build here with your own two hands. Money runs out. What you build does not. Not if you build it right, and not if you build it for reasons bigger than yourself. I am sorry I waited so long to explain myself. I hope you will do better than I did, and say the hard things sooner, to the people who deserve to hear them. With more love than I ever managed to show you while I had the chance, Grandpa Josie read it twice, the second time slower than the first, and when she finally looked up, Ruth Voss was watching her with an expression that had softened considerably from the sharp, measuring look she'd worn on arrival. He came to see me. Near the end, Ruth said quietly. Told me everything in that letter, more or less, face to face, the year before he passed. Asked what I thought he ought to do with the land. I told him what he'd have to do with it eventually was let it go to someone who'd actually use it, not sit on it like a monument to a mistake he couldn't undo by staring at it. I don't think he much liked hearing that. But I think it's why he finally wrote you that letter instead of just leaving you money and a deed and no explanation at all. Josie folded the letter carefully back along its original creases, aware of Russell watching from the doorway with the particular stillness of a man who understood he was witnessing something that wasn't quite his to comment on, and aware, too, of the strongbox still sitting open on the concrete floor, money that suddenly felt like a much smaller part of the morning than it had an hour before. He said, building something here was the real gift, Josie said. I don't even know where I'd start. Ruth's mouth curved into that almost smile again, fuller this time. You start, she said, the same way my father did, 60 years ago, in a drought nobody thought they'd survive. You start with what's already here, and you don't let yourself believe it's worthless just because it looks rough going in. She glanced toward the back corner of the hut, toward the ledgers still stacked where Josie had left them. There's more in those journals than just my name, if you're inclined to read the rest. Your grandfather wrote down a great deal more than he ever said out loud. Might be some of it answers questions you haven't thought to ask yet. Josie looked toward the ledgers, and then back at the strongbox, and then, finally, out through the crooked doorway, at the half-acre of frost-silvered weeds that were, as of 3 days ago, entirely hers. "There's a lot of work ahead of this place," she said, half to herself. "There is," Ruth agreed, pushing herself up from the folding chair with the help of her cane. "But I expect that's rather the point. The work started small, the way big work always seems to when you're standing at the very beginning of it, with no clear sense of the middle." Josie spent the better part of a week just clearing, hauling collapsed shelving out to a burn pile Russell helped her build, pulling 3 decades of weeds by hand because she couldn't yet afford a mower, patching the worst of the roof gaps with sheet metal Dale sold her at what she suspected was well under cost, though he wouldn't admit to it when she asked. She used some of the strongbox money, carefully. The way you spend money, you understand, isn't really yours to waste. A little for materials, a little held back, most of it left sitting in a bank account in town that still didn't feel entirely real to her yet. The ledgers gave her a rhythm to work by. Each night, she read a few more entries by lantern light, her grandfather's cramped handwriting filling in a decade and a half of a life she'd never known him to be living. He'd written about small repairs, about conversations with Ruth, about a plan, never quite finished, always slightly reworked, to eventually turn the hut into something. A community space, one entry suggested, a place families without much could come stay a season while they got back on their feet, the way the well itself had once kept people going through a summer that should have broken them. "I don't know if I'll ever manage it," one entry read, dated only 8 years back. "But it feels like the only use for this place that would make the debt mean something instead of just sitting here as a monument to it." Josie read that entry 3 times before she let herself believe what it was telling her, that the vague, half-formed instinct she'd been circling all week about what this land might eventually become wasn't really her own idea at all. It was his. He just hadn't lived long enough to build it. She told Russell about it over coffee one grey morning, sitting on the tailgate of his truck while a light rain ticked against the metal roof of the hut behind them, and he was quiet for a while before he answered, the particular quiet of a man deciding how much encouragement to offer somebody who hadn't asked for it yet. "It's a good idea," he said finally. "Whether it's a doable one is a different question. This building needs a new roof section, proper insulation, if you're housing anybody in winter, plumbing that isn't just a hand pump and a rain barrel. That's not weekend work. That's real money, and a lot of it, even with what your grandfather left you." "I know," Josie said. "I've been doing the math. It's not good math." "No," Russell agreed. "It rarely is, starting out." He didn't offer false comfort, which she'd already come to appreciate about him. He simply told her the truth and let her decide what to do with it, the way he'd let the pump handle do the work, instead of forcing it. The setback came 10 days later, and it came the way setbacks in real life usually do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but as the accumulation of several small bad decisions and one piece of very bad luck arriving at exactly the same time. She'd hired a local contractor Dale recommended to patch the worst section of roof properly, paying half up front out of the strongbox money, the way the job required. The contractor took the deposit and, over the following week, did roughly a third of the promised work before simply stopping, not answering calls, not showing up, the kind of small-town disappointment Dale apologized for with genuine embarrassment, having vouched for the man in the first place. The unfinished roof section left a gap wide enough to let in the next hard rain, which arrived 4 days later, harder and longer than the forecast had promised, and by morning, Josie was standing in the back corner of the hut, looking at a spreading water stain across the ledgers she'd left stacked too close to the wall, 3 of them soaked through badly enough that whole pages had gone soft and illegible. She sat down hard on an overturned bucket in the middle of the mess, and, for the first time since the funeral, let herself cry. Not delicately, not for very long, but hard enough that it emptied something out of her that had been building since long before she'd ever heard of a rusted Quonset hut on Route 9. It wasn't just the ledgers, though losing pieces of her grandfather's handwriting felt like its own small grief. It was the math Russell had warned her about, suddenly very real and very unkind. It was the deposit money gone to a contractor who wasn't answering his phone. It was the creeping, familiar fear that she'd done exactly what she always did, reached for something that looked like a second chance, and found, once again, that it was mostly just more of the same hard road she'd been walking her whole life. Russell found her there an hour later, having driven out with no particular reason, beyond a habit of checking on her that had quietly become part of both their routines. And he didn't say much at first, just surveyed the damage, the sagging roof gap, the ruined pages, Josie still sitting on the bucket with her eyes red and her hands raw from the week's work. "This is the part nobody tells you about," he said eventually, crouching down to look at the water-damaged ledgers without touching them. "Everybody wants to talk about the discovery, the letter, the money, the big turn where everything starts looking up. Nobody talks much about the part where the roof leaks and the contractor runs off with your deposit, and you sit on a bucket, wondering if you made the whole thing up in your head." "Did I?" Josie asked, and hated how small her voice sounded asking it. "No," Russell said, simply, without hesitation, the kind of flat certainty that carried more weight than a longer answer would have. "You didn't make any of it up. You just hit the part of the road that's actually hard, instead of just hard sounding. There's a difference, and most folks quit right about here, because this is where it stops being a story and starts being work, with no guarantee at the end of it." He helped her carry the ruined ledgers out into what daylight there was, laying the salvageable pages flat to dry on a tarp spread across the hood of her car, and between the two of them, they managed to save more than Josie had feared in the first raw hour of finding the damage. Enough, at least, that the story wasn't entirely lost, even if pieces of it now had permanent water stains running through her grandfather's handwriting like a second kind of scar. "Roof first," Russell said, once the pages were laid out. "Everything else waits on that. And I know a man who'll actually finish the job this time, if you'll let me make the call instead of Dale." Josie looked at the gap in the roof, at the drying pages, at the whole unfinished, expensive, uncertain shape of what she'd taken on, and found, underneath the exhaustion, something that hadn't been there in the moment she'd first sat down on the bucket. "Yeah," she said, "make the call." The new contractor, a quiet man named Hollis that Russell vouched for personally, finished the roof inside of 9 days, and for a while after that, the work took on an almost peaceful rhythm, plumbing rough-in, insulation, the slow transformation of a rusted steel shell into something that might, with enough time, actually house people. Josie fell into a routine of early mornings and aching hands, and evenings spent going back over the salvaged ledger pages, piecing together her grandfather's plan in fragments, the way you'd reconstruct a photograph from torn pieces. It was in one of those fragments, faded but legible, that she found the first mention of the money that hadn't come from the strongbox at all. "Spoke to the bank again today," the entry read, dated some 11 years back. "They won't extend past what I've already borrowed against the house, without more collateral. I may have made an error putting so much into this place before I had the rest secured. If it comes to it, better the debt lands on me than on anyone I love." Josie read that entry twice, a cold unease settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature in the hut. She'd assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that the money in the strongbox represented the whole of what her grandfather had set aside for this place, a clean, self-contained gift. This entry suggested something messier, a loan, collateral, a debt that might not have died with him. She brought it to Ruth the next afternoon, over coffee at Ruth's kitchen table, a small tidy house on the edge of town that smelled like cedar and old books. "I wondered when you'd find that part," Ruth said, not unkindly, but with the particular weariness of someone who'd been waiting for a hard conversation to finally arrive. "Your grandfather did borrow against his own house, later on, trying to fund improvements out here faster than his savings alone would allow. I don't know the full shape of it, whether it was paid off before he passed, or whether it's sitting somewhere in his estate waiting to surface. That's not the kind of thing he discussed with me in detail, but I'd be lying if I told you I thought it was entirely settled." "If it's not settled," Josie said slowly, "and it's tied to the house, that's Ruth's house, my sister Ruth's house, not this property." Saying the two Ruth's names side by side, out loud, struck her as strange, a small collision of separate lives that had never had reason to touch before now. "Then perhaps," Ruth Voss said, "that's a conversation you're going to need to have with your sister, sooner rather than later." It was not a conversation Josie wanted to have, and she put it off for 4 more days, through the last of the insulation work and the first hard frost of the season, before finally calling Ruth's number with hands that weren't quite steady on the phone. Ruth's voice, when she picked up, carried the same clipped distance it always had. The sound of a sister who'd spent years deciding Josie was the problem in the family and never found much reason to revise the opinion. "There's a lending record," Josie said, after the strained pleasantries had run their short course. "From Grandpa, against the house. I don't know if it's still outstanding, but if it is, I wanted you to hear it from me before it showed up as a surprise." The silence on the other end of the line went on long enough that Josie thought the call might have dropped. "There's no lending record," Ruth said finally, her voice gone tight, in a way Josie recognized from 100 childhood arguments. "The house is clear. Faye and I both had the estate lawyer confirm that, before probate even closed. The ledger says—" "I don't care what some old notebook says," Ruth snapped, and then, quieter, with something underneath the anger that sounded almost like fear, "Look, Josie, Faye and I got the house and the land because that's what was left to split, fair and square. And you got a rusted shed and $1, because that's apparently what Grandpa decided you deserved. I'm not going to sit here and let you turn that into some story where actually you're the one who saved us all from a hidden debt. That's not how this works." The words landed harder than Josie expected, old and familiar in a way that ached. The same accusation, in different clothes, that had followed her through most of her adult life. You always make yourself the center of it. You always find a way to be the one who matters most. "I wasn't trying to," Josie started, and then stopped, because she genuinely didn't know how to finish the sentence in a way that would land as anything other than exactly what Ruth had already decided it was. The call ended badly, both of them retreating into the kind of silence that wasn't really peace, just exhaustion with the argument itself. Josie sat afterward on the tailgate of her car in the gathering dark, the half-finished hut looming behind her against a sky gone the color of a bruise, and felt, for the first time since the letter, the full weight of exactly how alone she still was in most of the ways that mattered. The money was real. The land was real. Ruth Voss's kindness and Russell's steady, uncomplaining help were real. But her own sisters, the people who were supposed to have known her longest, supposed to have carried some baseline understanding of who she actually was, still saw her the same way they always had, The one who left. The one who made things about herself. The one who couldn't just quietly accept $1 and a rusted shed and be grateful for whatever scraps the family decided to hand her. She thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, the one she'd read so many times now that the creases had gone soft. I hope you will do better than I did, and say the hard things sooner, to the people who deserve to hear them. She hadn't said the hard thing to Ruth. Not really. She'd led with a debt and a warning and let the actual truth that she'd wanted, for one unguarded moment, for her sister to be glad she'd found something good, instead of suspicious of it, stay buried where it was safer. Somewhere behind her, in the dark, the well pump gave a faint metallic tick as the temperature dropped, the sound carrying across the frost-hardening ground like something almost alive, and Josie sat there a long while longer, unsure which unresolved thing weighed heavier. A debt she still didn't understand, or a sister she wasn't sure she knew how to reach anymore. The storm arrived 11 days later in the season than storms like it usually came, which was part of why nobody in Millrace Fork had taken the forecast quite seriously enough. Josie had spent the morning finishing the last of the interior framing, 3 small sleeping rooms taking shape along the back half of the hut, a modest kitchen space roughed in near the front, the shape of her grandfather's unfinished plan finally becoming something you could stand inside and actually picture working. The sky had gone a strange greenish-gray by early afternoon, and by the time Russell called to tell her the county had issued a warning, the wind was already strong enough to rattle the loose sheet metal Hollis hadn't gotten around to securing on the north side. "You should come stay at my place," Russell said, over a phone connection already crackling with interference. "Storm like this, that building's not tested yet, new roof or not. I've got maybe 20 minutes of daylight left to secure what I can," Josie said, already moving, already pulling on Russell's spare work gloves. "I'll be careful, I promise." She should have left. She knew that even as she said it, and she told herself later, in the exhausted clarity that comes after a crisis has passed, that it wasn't stubbornness exactly, or not only stubbornness. It was the plain fact that 11 days of work sat vulnerable on that north wall, sheet metal that would tear clean off in a hard enough gust and take a section of new insulation with it, and she genuinely believed she had time enough to lash it down properly before the worst of it arrived. She did not have time enough. The wind came up faster than the forecast had promised, the greenish sky curdling into something darker within the space of 10 minutes. And Josie was still up on the ladder against the north wall, securing the last strap of metal sheeting, when the first real gust hit hard enough to rock the ladder sideways under her. She didn't remember the fall itself so much as the after, flat on her back on cold, half-frozen ground, the wind screaming past the open doorframe above her, a sharp white pain radiating up through her left ankle that made the rest of the storm feel almost distant by comparison. She lay there for a long moment, rain starting to needle down sideways across her face, genuinely unsure whether she could get up at all. This is how it ends, some small, exhausted part of her mind offered, with the flat, unhelpful clarity that comes with shock and cold, not with the money running out, not with Ruth never speaking to you again, just this. Flat on your back in the mud, with nobody close enough to hear you if you called. But that thought, once it had finished arriving, didn't feel true, and something in her, the same stubborn, self-reliant instinct that had gotten her through 100 worse nights than this one before she'd ever heard of a Quonset hut, pushed back against it hard enough to get her moving. She dragged herself up onto her good leg, using the fallen ladder as a brace, and half-crawled, half-hopped the 20 feet back toward the open doorway, the wind trying to peel the loosened sheet metal off the wall directly above her head the whole way. She made it inside just as the worst of the gust tore the last unsecured panel free entirely, sending it cartwheeling off into the dark. and collapsed against the inside wall, soaked through, her ankle already swelling hard against her boot, shaking with cold and adrenaline in roughly equal measure. It was Russell who found her 40 minutes later, having driven out through weather he probably shouldn't have driven through at all, worry outweighing good sense the way it does for people who've quietly decided somebody matters to them more than they've said out loud. He got her into his truck, got her ankle wrapped and elevated, got her to the small clinic in town, where a doctor confirmed a bad sprain, not a break. Lucky, everyone kept telling her, though it didn't feel especially lucky at the time. She spent that night on Russell's couch, unable to sleep, listening to the storm wind down outside into a steady, exhausted rain, replaying the fall over and over, the ladder tipping, the white pain, the flat certainty that she might genuinely be alone out there, with no one close enough to help. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, her phone buzzed with a text she didn't expect. "Russell called me. Are you okay?" Not from Faye. From Ruth. Josie stared at the message for a long time before answering, her thumb hovering, unsure whether the anger from their last call still sat between them, or whether the storm had somehow cracked a door she hadn't expected to open again this soon. "Sprained ankle," she typed finally. "Could have been worse. I'm okay." The reply came fast enough that Ruth must have been sitting up waiting for it. "You scared me. I know we didn't leave things good last time we talked. I've been thinking about it since. Can we talk properly, when you're up to it? Not about the money, about us." Josie read it twice, throat tight, and found that whatever armor she'd been carrying around her sister for years had gone thin and porous somewhere in the last 24 hours, worn down, maybe, by a ladder and a storm, and the particular vulnerability of realizing exactly how much could be lost in a single bad 10 minutes, and exactly how much she still wanted a chance to fix the things that weren't yet broken beyond repair. "Yeah," she typed back. "I'd like that." She fell asleep sometime after that, finally, to the sound of rain slowing outside Russell's window, her ankle throbbing dully under its wrap, and woke the next morning to daylight, and a text from Russell already up, and making coffee in his kitchen, and the quiet, hard-won understanding that she had survived something last night. Not just the fall, and not just the storm, but the older, more familiar fear that she'd always be the one standing alone in the dark, with nobody close enough to hear her. She hadn't been, this time, and that, she thought, watching grey morning light spread slowly across an unfamiliar ceiling, might turn out to be the actual discovery this whole strange year had been building toward all along. Ruth drove out 3 days later, once Josie's ankle could bear a slow walk around the property without a cane, and stood for a long moment just inside the crooked doorframe, taking in what her sister had actually built. The framed sleeping rooms, the rough kitchen space, the well pump running clear water into a new basin Hollis had installed the week before. "It's more than I pictured," Ruth admitted, and there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it, like she was revising a version of the story she'd been carrying since the reading of the will. "I think I assumed, I don't know what I assumed, that you'd sell it maybe, or let it sit the way Grandpa did toward the end. I didn't picture this." "I didn't either," Josie said. "Not at first." They sat on the tailgate of Josie's car, the way she'd taken to sitting with Russell most mornings now, and Josie told her sister the whole of it, slowly, the parts she hadn't managed to say clearly over the phone, the letter, the ledgers, Thomas Voss and Ruth Voss, and the drought-era well, their grandfather's guilt carried quietly for 50 years, and finally set down, imperfectly, in a strongbox and a handwritten apology. Ruth listened without interrupting, which wasn't like her, and when Josie finally got to the part about the loan record in the ledgers, her sister's face went carefully still. "I need to tell you something," Ruth said, "about the house." It turned out the debt had been real, but smaller and further resolved than the ledger entry alone had suggested. A loan taken against the property years back, largely repaid before Everett Calloway's death, with a modest remaining balance that the estate lawyer had, in fact, quietly settled out of the general estate funds during probate, the kind of unglamorous paperwork nobody had thought worth mentioning to Josie at the time, given she hadn't been in regular contact with any of them to ask.
"I should have told you when you first called," Ruth said. "I got defensive instead. Heard debt on the house, and heard, underneath it, this whole story I've apparently been telling myself for years, about you finding some way to come out on top, even when you got the worst end of things. That's not fair to you."
"I know that's not fair to you. I think I've just gotten used to being angry at you for leaving, and it's easier to stay angry than to ask myself why you needed to." Josie felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the day of the funeral, maybe longer than that, years longer, if she let herself admit it.
"I left because staying felt like disappearing," Josie said, quiet, the words coming easier than she expected, now that the door had actually opened. "Not because of you specifically, just the whole shape of things. It felt like there wasn't room for the version of me that wanted something different than what everybody expected." "And now?" Ruth asked. Josie looked out at the half-acre, the framed rooms behind them, the well pump ticking faintly as it settled in the cold. "Now I think there's room for a lot of things I didn't expect." They talked for a long while after that, the kind of conversation that didn't resolve everything. Old hurt rarely clears in a single afternoon, but that cracked something open between them that felt, for the first time in years, like it might actually stay open if both of them kept tending it. Before Ruth left, she asked, almost shyly, whether she could come back sometime and help with the work, and Josie said yes, before she'd even finished thinking through what that would mean, because some answers didn't need thinking through at all. The weeks that followed moved faster than the months before them had. Word spread through Millrace Fork the way word always did there. Not through anything Josie announced, just through Dale mentioning it at the hardware store, Marguerite mentioning it after church, Russell mentioning it to anyone who'd listen with the quiet pride of a man talking about something he'd had a real hand in. And slowly, the skepticism that had greeted Josie's arrival 4 months earlier softened into something closer to investment. People who'd once eyed the rusted Quonset hut as an eyesore started showing up with donated lumber, an old refrigerator somebody's family didn't need anymore, a Sunday afternoon spent helping frame the last interior wall. Ruth Voss came out most weeks, sometimes just to sit and watch the work, sometimes to offer a piece of her father's history that filled in another gap in the ledger's water-damaged pages. On one of those visits, she brought a photograph Josie had never seen. Her grandfather, decades younger, standing beside a much older Thomas Voss in front of the half-finished well. Both men laughing at something lost to time, their friendship etched plainly across two faces Josie had only ever known separately. "He never told you about this either, I'd guess," Ruth Voss said, watching Josie study the photograph. "No," Josie said, "but I think I understand it now. All of it. Or enough of it, anyway." By the time the first frost gave way to a stretch of unusually mild weather, the hut had become something genuinely close to what her grandfather's ledgers had described. 3 finished sleeping rooms, a working kitchen, a common space warmed by a wood stove Russell had helped her install, the well running steady and clear the way it had for a family in crisis, 60 years before hers. It wasn't finished, not entirely. There was still work ahead, funding to secure for the next phase, a long road between what she'd built so far and the full vision her grandfather had sketched across a decade and a half of private, unfinished journal entries. But standing in the doorway one evening as the light went long and gold across the property, Ruth beside her, Russell's truck pulling in with a fresh delivery of lumber, Josie understood that she'd already crossed the harder distance, not the physical rebuilding, though that had nearly broken her more than once, but the slower,
quieter work of becoming someone who could receive a gift like this one, without needing to prove she deserved it first. She had built something, not alone in the end, though she'd expected to be. And somewhere in the doing of it, she'd found her way back to a sister she'd nearly given up on ever really knowing. Spring came to Millrace Fork the way it always did. Slow at first, and then all at once. And by the time the first real warmth settled over the property, the place Josie had inherited for $1 and a debt of back taxes bore almost no resemblance to the rusted, half-collapsed shell she'd first stood inside 8 months before. The sign went up on a Saturday morning in early April, hand-lettered by Dale, who'd insisted on doing it himself once he heard what Josie wanted it to say. Voss Calloway House, it read. Simple black paint on a plank of reclaimed barn wood, mounted just inside the gravel drive where anyone arriving could see it. Below the name, smaller, a second chance, for whoever needs one next. Ruth Voss stood beside Josie when the sign went up, leaning on her cane in the thin spring sunlight, and reached out to rest her hand briefly against the wood, the way you'd touch something you'd waited a long time to see finished. "My father would have liked this," she said. "He always did think that well was meant for more than just his own family's use." The first guests arrived 2 weeks later, a young mother and her 2 children, referred quietly through a county assistant's office Josie had spent the winter building a relationship with, staying in one of the 3 finished rooms while the mother got back on her feet after losing both a job and a place to live within the same hard month. Josie watched the woman's daughter run barefoot across grass that had, less than a year ago, been chest-high weeds choking a rusted steel shell nobody wanted, and felt something settle into place that had been unsettled in her for as long as she could remember. She thought, often that spring, about the letter still folded soft with handling in the drawer of her small bedroom. The gift is the land itself, and whatever you choose to build here with your own 2 hands. Her grandfather had been right about that, in the end, though it had taken nearly losing everything, a roof, a friendship, an ankle, a sister, to understand exactly what he'd meant. Ruth, her sister, came out most weekends now, no longer just to sit and watch, but to actually work alongside her, the 2 of them slowly rebuilding not just the property, but the relationship that had gone quiet and strained for the better part of a decade. Faye visited too, less often, still a little uncertain around all of it, but present in a way she hadn't been at the start. Russell remained exactly what he'd been from that first morning with the toolbox, steady, unglamorous, essential, the kind of quiet presence Josie had come to understand mattered more than any single dramatic gesture could. By early summer, the Voss Calloway house had hosted 4 families in total, each staying a season or less, each leaving having contributed some small piece of labor or knowledge back into the place before they moved on. A fixed fence here, a planted garden bed there, the slow accumulation of a community forming itself around a building that had once stood empty and forgotten for over a decade. On a warm evening in June, Josie sat on the front step with Ruth Voss beside her, watching the current family's children chase fireflies across the darkening field, the well pump silent and steady behind them, and found herself thinking back to the gas station parking lot, 400 miles and 8 months away, counting $327 for the second time, certain she had nothing left to build a life from. She'd been wrong about that. Not about the money. The money truly had been the smallest part of it, exactly as her grandfather had promised, in a letter written for a granddaughter he hadn't known how to reach any other way. The real inheritance had been something slower and harder to name, a well that refused to run dry, a family history rebuilt one water-stained ledger page at a time, a sister finally willing to ask the hard questions instead of assuming the worst, and a piece of land that had asked, quietly, for one more chance instead of simply being forgotten. If there's one thing this story leaves me thinking about, it's this. Sometimes, the thing everyone else calls worthless is really just waiting for the right person to stop seeing it that way. Sometimes, a second chance doesn't look like much at first. Sometimes, it looks like a rusted shed, or a dollar bill, or an apology 31 years too late. What matters isn't how small the beginning looks. It's whether you're willing to stay long enough to find out what it was always meant to become. If Josie's story moved you today, I'd love to hear which part stuck with you most: the letter, the well, or the sisters finding their way back to each other. Drop it in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. I tell a story just like this one every single week, about people who started with almost nothing and built something that lasted. I think you'll want to be here for the next one.